30 days. No added sugar. I thought it would be one of the healthiest things I'd ever done. Instead, by day 3, I was questioning the entire experiment. And by day 15, I ran into a problem I genuinely hadn't anticipated. Not a headache, not a craving, but something that made me realize just how deeply sugar had become part of my everyday life. So, I decided to find out what would actually happen if I spent 30 days without added sugar. And what I learned was very different from what I expected. For months, I'd been feeling sluggish. That afternoon energy crash had basically become a daily ritual. I'd eat lunch, get back to whatever I was doing, and somewhere around 3 o'clock, it felt like someone had unplugged me from the wall. I wasn't eating what I considered a terrible diet either. I cooked at home, ate vegetables, tried to get enough protein, and generally thought of myself as a reasonably healthy eater. Then, a friend suggested I try cutting out added sugar for 30 days. I figured it couldn't be that difficult. I wasn't going to stop eating fruit, vegetables, or dairy. I wasn't trying to eliminate carbohydrates. I was simply going to avoid foods and drinks with added sugars and see what happened. Day 1 was surprisingly easy. I felt motivated, I felt disciplined, and I spent most of the day eating pretty normally. Eggs for breakfast, vegetables and protein for lunch, plenty of water, and no obvious sugary snacks. Day 2 wasn't much harder. Then day 3 arrived, and that's when I realized I had underestimated the experiment. The first problem wasn't even a craving. It was the grocery store. I started reading labels more carefully and suddenly saw added sugar in foods I'd never thought of as particularly sweet. Condiments, pasta sauces, salad dressings, breads, breakfast foods, and countless packaged snacks all suddenly required inspection. I spent nearly 40 minutes standing in one aisle comparing labels, and I remember thinking, how did I never notice this before? The point wasn't that every one of these foods was unhealthy or that a few grams of added sugar automatically made something bad. What changed was that I was finally paying attention to how often added sugar appeared in foods I ate without thinking about it. Then the headaches started. By the third day, I had a dull pressure behind my eyes that hung around for most of the day, and I immediately assumed I was experiencing some kind of sugar withdrawal. But the more I looked into it, the less simple the explanation became. When you abruptly change your diet, headaches can have several possible causes, including changes in caffeine intake, meal timing, hydration, and overall carbohydrate intake. So I couldn't honestly say sugar itself was definitely responsible. What I could say was that something about changing my normal routine was making the first few days considerably harder than I'd expected. The interesting part was what happened after that initial struggle. By the end of the first week, I started noticing that my usual afternoon crash wasn't happening with the same intensity. Instead of hitting 3 o'clock and immediately wanting to lie down, I was still functioning. I wasn't suddenly overflowing with energy, but the difference was noticeable enough that I started paying attention to it. And that was the first moment when the experiment stopped feeling like a punishment and started feeling like an experiment I actually wanted to finish. Week 2 brought another surprise. My sleep seemed better.
I was falling asleep more easily and waking up feeling more rested, although I couldn't prove that eliminating added sugar was directly responsible. There were too many other variables involved. I was paying more attention to what I ate, eating fewer processed foods, and thinking more carefully about what I consumed throughout the day. But whether sugar was the direct cause or simply one part of a broader change, I was noticing a difference, and that was enough to keep me interested. Then I hit day 15, and this was the part nobody had warned me about. The headaches were gone, the novelty had disappeared, and I had developed this constant low-grade irritability
that was much harder to explain. I wasn't desperately craving candy all day. I was just becoming increasingly aware of how many normal social situations revolved around sweet food. At a birthday party, someone brought out a cake. Everyone gathered around, and I suddenly felt like I was participating in the event from the outside. Nobody was forcing me to eat anything, and nobody really cared that I wasn't eating it. But I cared. It made me realize that food isn't just fuel. Sugar can be tied to celebrations, comfort, nostalgia, rewards, and social rituals. And removing it from your routine can affect more than what happens in your kitchen. I also made a pretty obvious mistake during the first couple of weeks. I started eating enormous amounts of fruit because I had convinced myself that since it didn't contain added sugar, it was basically a free pass. 5 bananas in a day probably wasn't the smartest way to structure the experiment. That forced me to learn an important distinction. Avoiding added sugar doesn't mean naturally occurring sugars in whole foods suddenly become harmful. Whole fruit comes packaged with fiber, water, vitamins, minerals, and other nutrients. So treating all sources of sugar as nutritionally identical misses a huge part of the picture. The goal of my experiment wasn't to become afraid of sugar molecules. It was to understand how much added sugar I had been consuming without consciously choosing it. Week 3 was probably the hardest mentally. The initial motivation was gone. The finish line still felt far away, and there wasn't some dramatic new benefit appearing every few days. This is the stage where any habit change becomes difficult because you're no longer running on excitement. You're running on consistency. I had to stop thinking about what I was giving up and start paying attention to what I was gaining. I was more aware of labels, more deliberate about my meals, and much less likely to automatically reach for something sweet simply because it was there. Then, week 4 brought the most unexpected change of the entire experiment. My perception of sweetness seemed different. Foods that had previously tasted completely neutral, like plain Greek yogurt or roasted vegetables, suddenly seemed sweeter and more satisfying. That doesn't mean my taste buds had literally been reset in some dramatic biological sense, but my perception of sweetness did seem to have shifted. After several weeks of avoiding intensely sweet foods, foods with naturally occurring flavors felt more noticeable to me. It was subtle at first, but once I noticed it, I couldn't stop noticing it. On day 30, I decided to test that change. I bought a small piece of chocolate and ate it deliberately rather than impulsively. I expected it to taste good. What I didn't expect was how intensely sweet it seemed.
I actually had to stop after a few bites because the sweetness felt overwhelming. A food that previously would have disappeared almost automatically suddenly felt like a much bigger sensory experience. And that was the moment when I realized the experiment had changed something more important than my diet. So here's my honest verdict after 30 days. I don't think the lesson is that everyone needs to eliminate sugar for 30 days, and I definitely don't think one personal experiment can prove that removing added sugar will produce the same results for everyone. My energy seemed more stable, my sleep seemed better, and my perception of sweetness changed, but there were plenty of other things I changed at the same time. I also lost about 6 pounds during the month, although that number needs context because weight can change for many reasons, including changes in overall calorie intake, food choices, and water balance. I wouldn't use my experience as proof that eliminating added sugar automatically causes a specific amount of weight loss. The bigger result was awareness. Before this experiment, I thought I knew roughly what I was eating. After 30 days of reading labels and making deliberate choices,
I realized how often I had been consuming added sugar without really thinking about it. More importantly, I started noticing the difference between something I genuinely wanted and something I had simply gotten used to having. That distinction was probably more valuable than any number on a scale. And that's why I don't plan on going back to exactly how I ate before. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life terrified of a birthday cake or obsessively checking every ingredient label. That's not sustainable, and it's not the point. What I want to keep is the awareness. If I want dessert, I can have dessert. If I want something sweet, I can choose it consciously instead of automatically reaching for it every afternoon because that's what I've always done. So, was the 30-day experiment a mistake? Absolutely not. Was it easy? Not even close. The hardest part wasn't actually giving up candy or soda. It was discovering how deeply sweet foods were connected to my routines, my social life, and even the way I thought about food. 30 days didn't give me a magical new diet, but it did give me something much more useful, a better understanding of my own habits. And once you become aware of a habit, it's a lot harder to pretend you don't have a choice. If you're considering doing an experiment like this yourself, I'd approach it as exactly that, an experiment. Decide what you're actually eliminating. Pay attention to how you feel. Don't confuse added sugar with naturally occurring sugar in whole foods. And most importantly, don't assume that my experience will automatically be yours. The goal isn't to prove that sugar is evil. The goal is to find out what happens when you stop eating on autopilot for 30 days and start making deliberate choices instead. And that might have been the biggest surprise of the entire experiment. I started these 30 days thinking I was trying to get rid of sugar. By the end, I realized I was really trying to get rid of the habit of eating without thinking. That is something I'm much more interested in keeping.